You're listening to the Roundup Podcast, a podcast on reaching the college campus, developing leaders, and sending out kingdom multipliers. This podcast is created by the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention and provided through cooperative program giving.
Chase, how's it going, man?
It's going well, Mitch. How are you, man?
Doing really well. Well, I'm excited for this episode. If you've been listening to the Roundup podcast, we have gone through a couple of iterations of hosts. I started off as a singular host, then Callie came on, then I was singular host again. But I want to introduce you guys to Chase Abner. He has been a friend of Roundup. He's been involved in our events and our blogs, and a number of other things. But one of the things that I was thinking of in this new season, as we're thinking about the 2021-2022 academic year, is inviting on somebody who is one outside of the scope of Texas that can kind of speak nationally, but also somebody who just thinks differently than I do and asks different questions than I do. And so I said, Chase, hey man, I'd love for you to come on and be a guest host with us on Roundup for the foreseeable future. And he said yes. So, Chase, thanks for joining us, man.
Dude, you're welcome. I'm just honored that you'd even ask me to be a part of it. I just think so well of your leadership and what God's doing through Roundup that I'm just excited to be a part of it.
And I appreciate it. Well, you and Brian Fry paid a lot of dumb tax for me early on, and honestly, you still do in a lot of ways. So, man, I'm very appreciative of that. But, man, I think you're pretty well known in the collegiate domain. You know, you've been doing this for a minute in several different capacities. But for the listener that doesn't know who you are, who's this new guest host, can you just talk to us a little bit about, man, what you do, where you're from, a little bit about your family, and some things like that?
Sure, yeah. So currently I serve as the lead church planting catalyst with the Send Network here in Iowa, and then also have some responsibilities as a collegiate church planting catalyst, so helping to network and connect leaders and churches who are interested in planting to impact university communities. And so I've been doing that here from my home base in Ames, Iowa since January 2017. Live here with my wife of 17 years, Alicia. And we have 3 kids, Simon, Jonas, and Charlotte, who are 13, 11, and 10.
Dude, it blows my mind you've been married 17 years. You look like you're 30 years old, but...
You obviously aren't looking at all the gray in my beard.
There actually is. I just see wisdom when I see all that, though.
Yeah. That's dumb tax. That's dumb tax is what that is.
That's what that is. Yeah, I love it. All right, so you're church planting catalyst in Iowa, but also collegiate church planting catalyst for NAMB in general. So what can you tell us, how did you, I don't know, what gives Chase the credentials to do that? Like, tell us a bit about your background. How did you find yourself in this college domain and resourcing churches that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Dude, well, that story has to go all the way back to the fall of 2003 when I started graduate school in Southern Illinois. And that fall semester, first year grad school, I got in contact with a Baptist collegiate ministry there on that campus. And it was through my relationships I built there and with the director who was leading that ministry that I recognized my need for Christ. Even though I was raised in a church, it was not personal for me until that fall. And so I got involved with college ministry as a grad student, which is not normative. So kind of weird in that regard. But then after a couple of years, the director was leaving and he recommended that I fill in as the director until they found their next leader. And so long story short, I ended up being there 7 years, serving as a BCM director. I was a NAMB missionary, North American Mission Board funded missionary, but my job was leading the BCM there in that community. And then from there started doing some more regional work, trying to catalyze other new college ministries. And then that got into church planting. From there, I jumped into a role very similar to yours now, working with the Illinois Convention as the state collegiate director. In those 3 years that I did that job, my world kind of got blown open because I only experienced college ministry in a very specific way in a specific place. And I had a kind of a microcosmic view of what college ministry could be. I knew what the BCM did there. I knew what InterVarsity did on campus. I knew what Chi Alpha did on campus. I knew what some of the churches were doing, but I didn't really have a view into what God was doing in other places, and I didn't have an imagination for what it could be. So in those 3 years, I served as the state director in Illinois, I got exposed to people like Brian Fry, people like Keith Weezer, Rob Warren, and then the folks at Salt Company based out of Ames, Iowa. And so really just started learning and expanding my view of what was possible and what God was doing in some really cool ways in other places. And so from there, because of my relationship of learning about Salt Company, I was invited on staff. So I moved to Ames in 2015, served as the associate director of Salt Company with Mark Vance as my boss, and had a great year and a half on staff with them before God opened a door and it was clear that I needed to move into something new. And so that brings me to what I'm doing today. And so I've had experience, Mitch, as a BCM director, so leading campus-based ministry. I've had experience in the denominational seat, leading college ministry kind of at an arm's length and pouring into leaders and churches who are starting ministries. I have experience as a local church-based staff member in college ministry, and then I've kind of come back to the denominational chair, network chair of trying to help various churches and leaders in their efforts to reach and mobilize college students.
Man, so that's a pretty vast, you kind of dipped your toes into these different kind of ways of doing college ministry or these kind of different models. Just thinking about when you went to the Baptist convention there in Illinois, right?
Yep.
And then you get baptized in the lake of Keith Weezer, Brian Fry, Rob Warren. I'm just thinking about my own story, about how I'm just so thankful that the Lord in 2016, I was introduced to guys like yourself and Fry and Weezer and Warren and Saltco and all those guys, because it really gave me a vision of really what college ministry could be and the strategicness and the importance of it, because it wasn't just this, let's get students through this 4-year period. It was kind of highlighting how this is such a strategic moment to leverage a young person for the kingdom of God. So, man, what a trip you've been on. So let me ask you this question, Chase. Also, before I ask this question, I just want to say, this is a big reason why I'm glad to have Chase a part of this podcast, just from his vast, array of kind of experiences in college ministry, denominationally and local church and campus base, his respect for all these different ways of doing college ministry and resourcing college ministry. And so I just think he's got a lot to bring to the table when it comes to that. He kind of sees, the one thing I love about Chase is he just sees everything with a wider lens than I do. And I think of myself as I'm kind of a tunnel vision type of guy, and Chase always seems to just widen that lens for me, which I deeply respect about him. So with that being said, what have you seen have been like really the key, when you think about the two main ministries in college ministry, what's the key difference that you see between, let's say, a local church, a church-based college ministry, and a campus-based college ministry? I think there's an idea that sometimes we see these things as competing, or they don't get along, or they should, but how does that, it just kind of depends on the context, how those relationships flesh itself out. But why don't you give us, since you've been in both worlds, what do you see as the kind of the difference in each of these kind of ministries?
Yeah, man. I want to answer that question, but before I do, I definitely want to make a caveat and just say that if there seems like I'm throwing shade at any particular type of model or stream of college ministry, I'm not intending that at all. Our friend Paul Worcester, I don't know if he said it first, but I always quote him. He says the best kind of evangelism is the kind that you do. Mm-hmm. It's not a debate over, is it relational? Is it cold contact? Whatever. It's just doing it. And I have the same attitude towards college ministry. The best kind is the kind that you do. And for many of us, the way that we start in college ministry isn't the way that we end. And so that's fine. We all have a path to learn, to grow. And even beyond that, Mitch, even within parachurch college ministries, there's many styles. You've got everything from Crew and InterVarsity to campus outreach, which has a different, they all have different postures and relationships with local churches. And so, and the same with church-based. There's some church-based college ministries that have a more come and see approach, and then there's some that are very aggressive of having a presence on campus. And so there's a lot of diversity. So I have to paint with really broad strokes in this conversation. Yeah. But I know there's exceptions, Yeah. So y'all just give me grace as I talk through some of these things. Does that make sense? You good with that, Mitch?
Totally good.
Yeah. So I think about the key differences between campus-based and church-based ministries in terms of a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, you have a passion and urgency to reach students for Christ. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a passion to give students a robust Christian experience in the local church. And both ends of that spectrum are very important, should be important to any follower of Jesus. But at the same time, both ends of that spectrum can become a ditch if it's not properly tempered with value for the other end of the spectrum. And so, and what I've seen, and I think that you can trace this back even to some of the origin stories of the various streams of campus-based ministries or parachurch ministries, that they tend to operate more out of an urgency to reach students. Like that's kind of their operational value, is evangelism, outreach. How do we get to these students, believers or not, who are disconnecting from Christian faith in college? And, the story of Bill Bright, as he started Cru and just saw this void where the local church wasn't taking up responsibility. And so he out of that urgency, he went and built stuff that was campus-based and apart outside or alongside the local church instead of within the local church. And so, and that niche focus on outreach and urgency on students, it lets them contextualize, adapt, and innovate to reach students. They don't have the historic or methodological strictures that may come with, a denominational entity or especially a local church. And so they can be present, they can be with students, they can have meetings and activities that are where students are and at times that fit student schedule, all those things. Now, the dark side of that, though, is that it can unintentionally truncate a student's vision for a lifetime of discipleship. They're only given a very brief, and I would call it an artificial view of what it means to follow Jesus. Again, this is in the dark side when it's at its worst, or when it's not functioning quite the way that I think God would intend it to, because the students are able to experience, and I'm using air quotes, experience discipleship in a way that doesn't require or encourage them to be with believers who are younger than them or older than them, and be a part of an organization that isn't designed just to meet their needs and to have easy on-ramps for them to be a part of. So you look like you want to ask a question.
No. I'm just listening very intently.
Good. Yeah. So let's flip to the other end of the spectrum. And this is the church-based ministries. They operate more out of a passion for the robust Christian experience in the local church. And they take a longer view of discipleship that emphasizes belonging with other believers who are in different stages of life. They see that approach to be the best way to fulfill some of the commands of Scripture of the older generation teaching the younger generation. And that's super important, of course. But there's a dark side of that too, whereas a focus on, hey, what does it look like to be a robust, lifelong disciple of Jesus, leads them to create ministry structures that are not really accessible to students who aren't already Christian or who don't know that they need that. And again, I mentioned earlier the come and see approach where, well, we've created all these airtight doctrinal statements and methodologies that are guaranteed to produce healthy disciples in a multi-generational context, been so focused on that they think if we have this really healthy thing, then students are just going to be drawn to it. And I think that's a faulty wager. The message of Christ to his followers are to go to the nations, to go. And I would say, go to campus. Don't just wait for them to come to you. And so again, the dark side of being on that end of that spectrum can lead you to that place. Not necessarily so. In either of these cases, the dark side isn't a necessary conclusion, but it's where you end up if you're not properly tempered. And so, like most things in the Christian life, the middle path is probably the place to be on that, where you're holding that tension between, like, we want to be accessible, we want to be present with students, we want to be outreach and evangelism focused, but not at the expense of having a local church body and belonging with people that requires you to sacrifice self. It requires you to give up some of your preferences in terms of when you can meet and what it looks like to meet. So that's the big difference. Is they're driven by different but equally valuable passions that can get us either side off kilter.
Yeah. No, that's great, Chase. And, I think so oftentimes what can happen, especially in those conversations, that you just kind of overvalue one over the other. But realistically, we need to have an urgency to reach lost people, have on-ramps and then give them a holistic experience in the local church for long-term discipleship. So that's really good. To tack onto this, I want to, when we think about college ministry, let's shift gears, so specifically talking about local church. You know, you have age grades in local churches. You're going to have your children's ministry, your youth ministry, college, young adult, young married. You're going to have all these kind of things. And I think what can happen in a local church is that sometimes we can just see college ministry as this, just a time that we need to get students through these 4 years onto that adulthood, that career, or even to the young family. As I mentioned earlier, when I was baptized in the lake of Brian, Chase, Weezer, and all those guys, I realized that college ministry was so much more than that. And I got to see the strategicness of college ministry. And it really made me, I think for me, myself personally, is I thought, I don't know what this will look like my whole life, but I feel like when it comes to ministering to college students, I'm a lifer now. Like the strategicness of the generation, it so captured my heart and my mind that I just don't think I could shake it. But will you kind of flesh out a little bit of the significance of the moment of ministering to college students and why such the big deal around a college ministry? Like, what's the significance of that moment in the 4 years of a student?
Yeah. Oh, man. I think about this often in terms of like where they are, why they're there, and who they are. So for college campuses across the U.S., from JUCO, community colleges up to elite schools, we're talking about like the top 1% in the world, as far as, not in terms of their value to God. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about earning potential. I'm talking about influence. I'm talking about the people who are going to have the key voices in deciding the shape of our communities, from small communities to cities to nations. And so that's who they are. These are the people that are on these campuses, and that's who they're becoming by and large. And the where they are, or maybe the better word would be how they are, Mitch. They're living in close proximity to one another. They're spending their time each day in many of the same places, doing the same type of things. And even the students with more full schedules in terms of coursework, they still have a lot of margin. So, I've heard, I'm going to probably quote Josh Martin multiple times today, but, he was talking recently at Roundup about the dailiness of being a Christian and how the college years provide you a really unique opportunity to do that dailiness in community with other people. And so how students are makes them so strategic. The power and the possibility of mission and sharing life it's just unique. And I call it artificial, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It's unique. You're not going to have that really in most places, at least in America, at any other season of life than those years. And I'm speaking as a guy who turns 40 really soon with 3 kids. Like, my margins and my opportunities for that kind of life, like, it changes. And I wish it weren't that way, but it changes. And
it does.
I can push against that all I want, but there's only so much culture I can change and influence, in the world around me. But it just gets harder. So how they are in those years, it just provides such a great opportunity. And then why they're there, there's a reason the university campuses still have Greek organizations, because it's taken us all the way back to the time in the 1st century where people were coming to Athens to tell and hear something new, right? The scriptures tell us that in Acts 17. So it was that type of culture, people coming to hear ideas, to share ideas, coming from all over the world. And that's where university culture was born. That still exists in the U.S. and around the world today. And so there's a presumption that you're in college to be exposed to ideas and really to become who you're going to be and to be formed in order to make the mark that you're supposed to make in the world. And so that creates an openness, maybe even a curiosity for students to explore, maybe for the first time, without the same pressures of whatever their school and their home life and maybe in their home church or, religious background is, to wrestle with the big ideas of who I am, why do I matter, and what's God want me to do about it. And so all those pieces, and there's probably a lot more we could say on that, but for me, that's what it comes down to. It's how they're living, it's who they are, and it's why they're there.
Man, that's great, Chase. And I think for the person listening today that maybe you're in a position where, maybe you've been given this, maybe this is your first ministry job experience to be a college pastor, college minister, and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this for a couple of years and maybe mosey on to do something else. I just say hit the pause button for just a second and kind of think about some of those things that Chase just said, because when you look at someone who's in college, this is one of the most transformable times of their life, where they are out from under the the networks of mom and dad, of a school system that was, kind of more of an overseer of them in their high school, out of even their friends. And so there's an incredible amount of openness and learning that they're wanting to do. And as ministers of the gospel, we get a chance to do that. And I think college ministry is one of those things where can be very exhausting, because it's transient. Students are in and they're out. But I think this time is such a special, unique time that we can shape and mold them with the gospel of Jesus Christ and send them out. College ministry is a naturally sending ministry. They're not going to stay there. They're going to leave. They're going to go get jobs and spouses and, leave the state, city, whatever. And how we send them is very important. Chase, talk to us a little bit about folks like your Resonates and salt companies and even Redeemer down here in Texas have kind of said, hey, let's leverage this for church planting. Can you kind of talk to us about that? That just seems we hear a lot about church planting in the suburbs and things like that, which you do with North American Mission Board, but then you also resource and help collegiate church plant. So what's this value of collegiate church planting? Why is that even a thing?
Yeah, so it's a thing in part because there are so many students in these college towns, and the ratio of, I would say, Jesus-following churches in those communities seems to be lagging behind. So there's just a clear opportunity there. Many of these campuses are like cities in and of themselves when you think just the population, and we don't think twice about planting a church at a city that size somewhere around the world or elsewhere. So why not have that same intentionality with the campus community? So, but specifically, why the model of church planting when there's obviously, as we've talked, other methods and forms of reaching college students? That just comes back to the idea that there needs to be a healthy medium where how you're reaching students not just teaches them how to be a good Christian college student, but prepares them to walk with Jesus for a lifetime. Mm-hmm. Mark Vance, my pastor, says we're trying to grow oak trees for Jesus. And so for that reason, we want to, yes, be aggressive in reaching students, but also making sure we tap their roots into the right things that's going to sustain them for life, ministry, suffering, beyond the scope of what they'll experience in the 4 years or so of college. And so planting local churches that embrace that missional, I would just say the missiological opportunity of reaching students, but also reaching into the community. It's a both and approach for most of the churches that we're planting, because we just believe that's what's healthiest for a student in order to experience a robust discipling life, in college and beyond. So
Well, we're throwing around that term collegiate church plant. I think I'd be interested to know how you define this. Chase, you told me before, but I think I've already forgotten. But I would kind of define a collegiate church plant as probably a church that has in their top three emphasis reaching the campus. And then plus the top three emphasis reaching the campus, probably a church that has probably at least 40% of their body is maybe made up of students. And probably has, I would say, also a multiplication kind of in their DNA, and that's the vision and the direction in which they're heading as a church. Yeah.
Honestly, there's no hard and fast definition of collegiate church planting that I've experienced, and like I said earlier, the way that you start is usually not the way that you end up. Yeah. My phrase that I've been using for that as I train church planters is, your church is a draft of what it's going to be when Jesus comes back anyway. So just get something on the paper, get something that you're aiming at, and then have an open hand, see what the Lord does. And so I essentially say collegiate church planting is church planting that's done with a focus on reaching college students in the context. And so that would encompass churches that are a little bit more aggressive and maybe by design, higher percentage of students in the congregation. But that would also include churches, like Redeemer and Summit, Salt Company, Salt Network, that are being intentional on the outset of being multi-generational. And so, it ends up being, in many cases, they're high percentage of students early on, just because for the reasons we've already identified, that it's just I hate the term shooting fish in a barrel, because it's not practically how it feels to anybody who's trying to reach and disciple students. But the captive audience is a little bit easier to embrace, and the idea of being a part of something new, it just goes along with the student's experience of college anyway. And so community members are often a little, not reluctant, but are slower to join in. And so yeah, I mean, even the church I'm a part of now, though it started with 200 college students and about 20 community members, now 28 years ago ish, it's probably more, well, I don't know the numbers recently and even post COVID, but it's probably only 30 to 40% students in a Sunday service. So
gotcha. That's good. Yeah. Let's transition the conversation for just a second, especially as we're thinking about in light of the 2021-2022 school year. COVID is kind of fleshing itself out. We're getting kind of back to normal. We'll probably have fairly normal fall in most of the campuses around Texas and the nation. What do you think are some maybe opportunities in a post-COVID world in college ministry? Any opportunities you see there for college ministers in this coming up school year?
Yeah, definitely. And like many things with COVID and just pandemic, Mitch, I don't know that it created new problems in many of our churches and ministries, but it certainly exposed some weaknesses. It maybe exposed some strengths in some cases. I don't want to be all negative, but I think back to a little over a year ago, hearing Josh Martin, who's now with the RIM in San Antonio, formerly with Resonate, Josh saying something to the effect of, what they were saying and maybe what he's concerned about is that often in our ministries, we make students who can run our ministry playbook. But when that playbook is no longer there or no longer effective, they floundered in terms of their personal mission to make and multiply disciples. And so that was really challenging to me when I heard him say that, because I think back through my time with Salt Company and then leading ministries in my local church when I was a state collegiate guy, and then when I was a BCM director. Man, that was just convicting, knowing that I'd probably failed in that. And so we do a good job of transferring playbooks to students, but we need to be better at transferring principles. And that takes time, man. You can't do that overnight. And I think a well-designed playbook, that's the end game. But this has forced us to see even more how important that is. And let's be real, like, they're not going to have our playbook forever anyway. Like, whether there's a pandemic that takes it away or graduation, right? They're going to be moving on and in a new place. And if we haven't given them the principles behind why we make disciples and reach out to people the way they do, then it's going to be hard for them to contextualize that and to carry that spirit forward in a new place. And so I think the opportunity, again, and just answering the question directly, is for us to rethink our ministry playbooks so that we're better at transferring principles.
That's a great word. In fact, at the time of this recording, me and my wife went to a wedding. One of our students was in California, so we flew out there, and one of our other students who just graduated, a young female student, well, not going into her career, but even she was kind of talking with us about just the big difference between being actively involved in ministry and running the playbook on a campus versus doing that in a workplace. It's almost shell shock of like, man, there's a lot, the normal routines and the practices that I've done that really won't translate into a job kind of thing. So even, her thinking just through that and that transition between college and a career, and then even in post-COVID world of, how principles are really so important. And our friend Andy Aberson would say the same, and is probably saying amen as he's listening to us right now. All right, last thing here, Chase, that at least I have for you is this. One of the things you've been very involved in is networking. Roundup, we're huge on networking. I think the secret sauce of Roundup is connecting churches to churches. We think the best resource for local churches is local churches. You've been involved in networks for a while with NAMB. Kind of talk to us a little bit about the value of networking and maybe some advice you give to a college minister that's maybe out on an island or just getting started, or maybe he's not having many connections with other collegiate leaders.
Yeah, for sure, man. I've already shared in my story, and you shared in yours as well, just how getting in the rooms with people doing things differently, but valuing kind of the same end, was been just revolutionary it's been revolutionary for me personally in my discipleship and then again in my leadership and my ministry. So it's hard to overstate the value of networking, taking advantage of events like Roundup, College Metro, et cetera, where you can be in the room with people who you don't have to explain why you're trying to minister to college students. Like, that conversation is already settled.
Yeah.
And so that allows you way more freedom to just dive in to other practices, nuts and bolts, and learn from other people. So networking in that regard is totally important. But I would say also there's value in putting yourself in rooms where you do have to explain why you do what you do and why it's important, because it makes you think about it through the lens of somebody maybe who is like a student who doesn't see any value in college ministry, and you're having to, in a sense, justify why you get paid to do what you do, or why you volunteer and sacrifice so much of your time to do what you do. And so it's almost like one of those things where it's so important to me, it's hard to even explain the value of networking. Other than it just blows up your view. I went from having a microcosmic experience I knew what college ministry looked like in Carbondale, Illinois, from 2003 to 2012. So I was there for 9 years, 2 as a student, and then seven as the director of the BCM there. And that's kind of all I knew about what college ministry looked like, was what I saw in that season. So moving into a different role, getting exposed to people who dared invite me into rooms, maybe took a risk of having me in those rooms. Yeah. But it made so much of the difference for me. It helped me bust out of some of my dumb, closed-handed views of how to do things, and really gave me just a deeper appreciation for the body of Christ and a better imagination for what was possible.
Yeah, that's a good word. And I see that happening, man, all over. I know in my own personal life, but all over this, the work that we get to do here in Texas. I've seen the greatest leaps of growth in a ministry when a leader is willing to humbly listen and learn from other folks, and then also give their advice as well, because it's so funny. I always find that a lot of church leaders, they think a lot of the things they do are very normal and even elementary sometimes, and they don't realize how evolutionary they can be or revolutionary. That's probably the better term, right? I don't know. But to other churches, to other churches, like, man, really? And they're like, yeah, well, it's kind of a normal play that we run, but for another church, that could be something that's that unlocks a lot of opportunity for them. So, yeah,
the humility that you mentioned, man, it's so critical, because I think for many of us in our own context, whether on staff at a local church or we do support raising, like, oftentimes we feel like we have to talk about what we do like it's clearly the best thing that we do, and it's clearly the right way to do things, because we want people to get on board and feel confident in us, so that they'll join our support team, or so that the budget committee will allocate resources to what we're doing. Yep. But in a networking situation, and you just have to check that and be like, you know what, I might not be doing things the best that I can, and that's okay. I'm willing to entertain the possibility that somebody, even if their ministry is smaller than me, even if it's in a very different context, that there's some principles at play that could really make us more faithful and effective. So.
That's good, man. Well, Chase, that's all the questions I got for you, man. You got anything left before we shut this baby down?
Man, I don't know. I just look forward to being a part of this podcast with you, and I love hearing you think, Mitch. You're always just encouraging and challenging to me as well. And so getting to tag team up on some folks over the next handful of episodes will be a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, it's going to be tons of fun. And we got guys like Dean and Sarah down in Tallahassee, Florida. We're going to have him on. Josh Martin from the Rim Church. We've got the Salt Company. We'll have them on. So super excited about the guests that we'll get to have on and try to expand, really trying to find, hey, who's doing great things around the country in the areas of college ministry, and what can we learn, and how can we bring that wisdom to our listeners here on the Roundup podcast. So super excited. We're still going to keep the same flow. We're going to have 2 podcasts a month that'll be coming out, and those will just follow soon after this episode. But Chase, thanks for jumping on today. Yeah, man, glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. Take care, man.
You got it, brother. Well, friends, thanks for joining us on the Roundup podcast. Hey, don't forget, follow us on social media at SBTC Collegiate. Subscribe to our channels you can do Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and subscribe so that way you can get the latest episodes. And we will see you next time.